Thank you, Allison, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here today. It's really wonderful to be here at the annual Day of Learning for ASF and to have a moment to think about and talk about the changing autism research landscape. I'm going to start by bringing us back to 2020. And I have to apologize that I'm only bringing you back to 2020 and not, say, 2023 or 24. But this is also a piece of the changing autism research landscape. The data I'm going to show you is the latest data that we have available to us because of the inability currently of NIH to provide us with more updated data. And that's a combination of the fact that they've decimated the staff of the Office of Autism Research Coordination at NIMH that provides and compiles this data, and they've also basically prevented them from publishing updated reports, although we hope some of those are going to come out soon. So as you can see from this graph that I'm showing you, there were, over the course of much of the last 2 decades, consistent, modest increases in federal support for autism research, shown in yellow, in the yellow part of the bars, and a consistent base of private funding for autism research that grew more slowly, if at all, during that period of time. The other thing you'll notice about the funding landscape circa 2020 is the domination by federal funds. So up until even very, very recently, it was clear that the majority of autism research was being funded by federal sources. Those federal sources were predominantly, actually overwhelmingly, from the National Institutes of Health, from several institutes there, and with some smaller amounts contributed by the CDC and other federal agencies. There were and still are major players in the private funding space, as well as international funders as well, which are not included on this slide. The total amount spent on autism research in 2020 was something close to $400 million, which approaches, but doesn't quite meet, the recommendations of the Interagency Coordinating Committee at the time, that an appropriate level of autism funding would be something between $500 and $800 million. In terms of what was being funded in autism research in 2020, you can see about half of the dollars spent on autism research, both by private and public funders, was spent on trying to understand the biology underlying the illness. That's the pink part of this pie. Genetic and environmental factors, identifying those factors, characterizing them and their interactions, was another sixth or so. And then the various other parts of the funding pie focused on screening and diagnosis, infrastructure and prevalence, lifespan, services and support, and interventions. Now, why am I going into this detail? I'm going into this detail for several different reasons. One, I'm going to show you very soon how that landscape is changing. The other thing to show is that there was and still is a predominance of focus on the origins of the illness and the biology that arises from those illness. And while certainly we need a greater understanding of what works for people now, a big part of that reason is because the recognition by the scientific community that it's really hard to address the issues that matter to individuals and families with autism because we don't understand the fundamentals of the underlying that condition. And so while considerable investments have been made, as you can see, on the order of $150 million a year or so, on more near term, the biology and genetics was and continues to be important to explore. What were the research investments that emerged in that period of time as we reached from 2008 to 2020? Obviously, autism genetics and understanding the genetic factors that lead to autism were of significant import and have had a tremendous impact on the field. So this is a figure from one of the papers at the time, just demonstrating the first few dozen genes that were linked to autism and, importantly, the networks that they comprise. That is, how those genes interact with each other, so that by the year 2020, and actually even more so in the last few years, we've really begun to understand not just individual genetic factors leading to the illness, but how they cooperate together in biological systems, therefore giving us the potential to understand what pathways in the brain and elsewhere in the body are affected in autism. Other important advances include an understanding of how autism phenotypically and biologically arises in girls and women. It was an understudied field at the time, say, the beginning of that period in 2010. Understanding of the issues, the near-term issues faced by transition-aged youth and solutions for those issues, as well as services like housing and support. I highlight these 4 areas of investments and research that were being made throughout this period because of the focus that Allison mentioned on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which I led during much of that period of time, and to highlight the fact that many of these areas of research, especially the focus on girls and women, on housing and support, and on transition-age youth, these foci of research that the federal government invested in during that period of time came directly as a result of conversations with the autism community that occurred in the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, and illustrating the importance of not just any interactions, but specifically interactions with the federal government and the autism community, so that we could learn, and I'm saying we as a past member of that federal research community, we could learn the issues that were important, and we could bring research to address those issues forward. Now, since 2020, there have been a number of emerging topics that have arisen from the community and from that science. One is evident by some of the sponsors of today's learning, and you'll hear more about in the afternoon from one of our speakers. We, having identified now hundreds of genes that contribute to the risks for autism, we need to take that genetic information and move towards not just understanding, but therapies that can arise from it. And that means not only thinking about the genes as targets for therapies, but also understanding how those genes and networks interact with the environment, what biological processes are altered that lead to autism and lead to the many significant challenges faced by individuals and families with autism, so that we can develop therapies, even traditional pharmacological therapies and psychological therapies that can address those underlying biological processes. Another emerging topic that grew out of that period of time was the appreciation for a need for greater understanding of the trajectories of illness, that we can follow individuals with autism and even individuals at risk for autism earlier and earlier in the course of their neural development. You'll see these trajectory charts I'm showing here, emergence of language, sensory pathways, and higher cognitive function, really start even before birth, which means we need to be able to follow individuals and study them in detail throughout this early period of time. And you already heard of a wonderful project being sponsored by ASF that does precisely that in babies that are at higher risk by virtue of their familial connections to individuals with autism. And then another emerging topic that also came out of that period of time was the need for greater understanding on the biology of co-occurring conditions. These plague all individuals with autism, and they include GI symptoms, anxiety, and other mental health conditions, and a range of other co-occurring conditions. And these co-occurring conditions occur at such high rates in individuals with autism that they most likely have some relationship to the underlying genetics. They have some relationship to the underlying environmental factors, and therefore studying them is not only made possible by the advances in understanding of those causes, but also needs specific focus. We need to study individuals with autism and the gastrointestinal symptoms they have and the anxiety symptoms they have in order to understand what biological processes specific to autism might lead to them and how we might better be able to treat these co-occurring conditions. In addition to these novel issues that have emerged, there have been novel approaches that we've been able to bring to bear. One of them that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the increasing use of digital technologies, not only to help track individuals with autism, help diagnose autism earlier and earlier, but also to deliver therapies. We're also very excited about the possibility of not just learning more through genetics, but actually using genetic technologies to advance therapies for individuals with autism, especially individuals with profound autism, where genetic therapies might be really necessary if we want to make a big difference for them. And then another novel approach becoming more and more clearly important, has been supported by many of the organizations in the room today, is large-scale data sets and really, really importantly, open data sharing of those data sets across the scientific community. I'm highlighting here the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, but of course there are many studies targeting following cohorts of individuals with autism, and that's really important. So these are the issues that we faced coming into last year. And then the autism community, as you already heard, has been sort of struck by a tsunami, like the rest of the scientific community, of rhetoric and of contradictory and, from my perspective, unhelpful language coming from not just our political leadership, but actually our health leadership and even some of the scientific community leadership. And that's created uncertainty around the funding landscape. So on the one hand, the president himself and the Secretary of Health and Human Services has targeted autism as being important. And so that you might think might be good news. But then along with that came with the concerns that the science might be slanted in a predetermined, politically determined direction as opposed to a scientific direction. And when the NIH announced its Autism Data Science Initiative, there were a lot of concerns that the science would be hijacked by politics. And I think the worst of those concerns have not yet been realized, in the sense that the grants funded by the Autism Data Science Initiative have been given to for the most part, if not exclusively, strong scientific members of our community, and the targets of those studies are open-minded, not predetermined, and generally helpful from a scientific perspective. We need to keep an eye on that funding landscape. And then you also heard that a lot of political decisions are being made at NIH, which have harmed members of our community, especially those most vulnerable members. When I say our community now, I'm talking about the research community, harmed them directly in terms of the loss of funding, and so we need to take that into consideration. But the final note I leave you with is a little bit of hope. So I think Allison had some slides at the I-ACC showing a more recent evaluation of the funding landscape, and what we've seen is new players entering the field from the private sector, in particular, of course, the ARIA initiative as being one of these new players, that seek to follow up on these emerging areas, such as genetic medicines, such as understanding networks, understanding human neurodevelopmental biology and tracking that through trajectories, and focusing on the needs of individuals and families with autism. And so I think that has led to already in 2025, I think a near doubling or maybe even tripling of the amount of private money, so that they're actually beginning to rival the amount of spending on the federal level. And I think that's a positive development that we can harness as we try to take advantage of these new approaches and meet the emerging needs of the autism community. So with that, I'll thank you, and I think I have a time for a question or two before I have to get off the stage.
Hi, Amy Lutz from NCSA. So we tell our families to reach out and leave public comment, and they sign petitions, and they send emails. And we're just wondering if people at NIH, to your knowledge, are they receptive to that feedback? Do they ever hear it? What is the best way that family stakeholders can make our priorities known to NIH?
So I think we need to continue with both official and unofficial channels. I think it's important that we continue to send public comments into the federal IACC. I think it's especially important that we as a community continue to talk with our federal representatives, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. I think making sure that they continue to hear from us is incredibly important in this time, even if you feel like your voices aren't being listened to. And then unofficially, I think, yes, our colleagues at NIH are still deeply concerned, like we are, that we continue to make advances in science, and reaching out to them, sending them emails, telling them what you think, and encouraging them to pursue good science is always going to help them, even if they might not be able to always respond, right? And then finally, I think it's really important that we keep up the pressure on the legislative branch and make sure that they understand the importance of enforcing the statutes on what the IACC is, enforcing the independence, the law on the independence of scientific decision making at NIH, and really trying to prevent the worst impulses of the edicts coming out of the White House and the Secretary's office at HHS. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you later.